We're going to start with a video here put out by Russian sources a couple weeks ago, and there's something just a little bit off about it. So in this video, Russia says that they destroyed a Ukrainian M270 MLRS rocket launcher, multiple launch rocket system with an Iskander strike in Sumy Oblast. They say the reason for no large secondary explosions, like you might expect in this scenario, is because they saw the M270 firing off all of their rockets previously, so it must have been empty. Could be that, or it could be that it's fake. It's a balloon. This is an inflatable rocket launcher. Here's a picture of it being tucked back into the woods prior to that strike. And that's what we're going to talk about today. The evolution of decoys in Ukraine and how far these have come and how they're still useful on the modern battlefield. Now, decoys serve a handful of purposes in modern war. The most obvious, like we just saw in this video here, is drawing fire away from an actual asset, right? So Russia used time, energy, and resources to conduct a missile strike on a balloon, essentially, that is time, energy, and resources not dedicated to striking the actual M270 MLRS that is likely somewhere else in the general vicinity. But there's also a less measurable aspect here as well, which is that the presence of these decoys, depending on the type and where they're located, could have a very real impact on Russian planning and or troop deployment. Now, starting with an article from the U.S. Naval Institute, it's linked in the description below, as will all articles referenced in this video. They say decoys mimic valuable assets, including U.S.-supplied M777 howitzers, HIMARS launchers, mortar tubes, D-20 and D-30 Ukrainian artillery tubes, American and German tanks, and air defense systems. The deception tricked Russian forces into using costly and sophisticated munitions, such as Lancet drones and Krasnopol precision-guided artillery rounds. Further, the extensive deployment of decoys may explain why Russian forces continually claim to have destroyed Western-supplied Ukrainian equipment since the beginning of the war. This has been a running joke for anybody following this war. From the very early phases, we have heard that 600 HIMARS launchers have been destroyed, that every Abrams tank has been knocked out probably 6 times over. More Western equipment has been destroyed in Ukraine than Western countries have provided Ukraine in the first place. One of the reasons for that might be all of the decoys that Russia is hitting. Or, of course, Russia could just be making up those numbers as well, but it's one explanation. Now, whenever I think of military deception, of course, some famous examples from World War II come to mind. We have the inflatable ghost army, and then, of course, the telephone poles at Pointe du Hoc that looked like massive howitzers from overhead, a deception only uncovered after the Rangers scaled those cliffs on D-Day. Now, I should note that the Rangers pretty quickly found those displaced guns and destroyed them, but that degree of deception, pretending that a telephone pole is a howitzer, it just won't fly today. Now, not long ago, something just had to look kind of good enough from grainy imagery, but that's changed so much in recent years. Now those decoys have to have multispectral signatures of the items they replicate, including thermal, radar, electromagnetic, visual, and even acoustic signatures. Now, today's video is sponsored by Aura, who I use as a secure VPN for digging into some of those very dark crevices of Telegram during the course of my research. Now, the reason that I like Aura is that it's an all-in-one package when it comes to your personal digital safety. Their individual plans include, of course, the VPN service that I use, but also a password manager, antivirus protection, home title monitoring, identity and credit monitoring, and an important one right now, data broker removal. I say that's important right now because over 2.9 billion records were just stolen from national public data. These stolen records include a person's full name, address, date of birth, social security number, and phone number, along with alternate names and birth date. And members of the hacker group have reportedly already released this information for free online. Now, Aura will alert you if they find any of your personal data available on the dark web, and they provide up to $5 million of identity theft insurance should the worst case scenario happen. Check out the link in the description or go to aura.com/Preston Stewart to begin your free 14-day trial. Now, it's an impressive set of tools. It's worth checking out. Now, let's run through some of the decoy types we've seen used in Ukraine from the least to most detailed, starting with a two-dimensional kind of baseline model here, painted on the ground. So jumping back into the US&I article, they say another decoy incident unfolded in September 2023 when satellite imagery unveiled a peculiar image at Russia's Engels Air Base, a painted Russian Tu-95 MS bomber on the airfield's tarmac. Though seemingly rudimentary, these decoys introduce a layer of uncertainty into the calculus of drone operators, particularly those tasked with discerning three-dimensional forms under low visibility conditions. Considering the substantial volume of data that analysts are tasked with processing, introducing additional layers of uncertainty could complicate the targeting process. Now, of course, to make these painted-on airplanes look realistic, there's something that you can't do. You can't park other aircraft over the top of them. That could give it away. You certainly can't park helicopters over the fixed-wing decoy. But either way, moving on through the next few items here, we've got wireframe/minimalist, which isn't an official name. It's what I'm going with, and I feel like if you look at these pictures, it kind of fits. Now, this is better than nothing, and it could trick an observer from quite a ways off, maybe an aircraft flying by at high speeds, but it won't really stand up to any sort of persistent reconnaissance. Now, the bright side here for these wireframe/minimalist design is that they're easy to put together, pretty cheap. The downside, however, is, of course, they do have pretty limited effectiveness on the modern battlefield. In fact, The Guardian conducted an interview with decoy manufacturers in Ukraine where they said, quote, "At the beginning of the war, it was very simple. The Russians would see something and try to hit it." But of course, that's changed as we've seen the nature of warfare change throughout this conflict. They added, quote, "The enemy is not stupid. We have to adapt to reality. We always add something new in our work, and we assess ourselves this way. If nothing happens when we send out a new model, if it isn't targeted, then we got something wrong in the design." So think about that aspect from the designer of these decoys. We're going to come into this more here in a minute, but success to them, in a lot of ways, is if Russia destroys the very thing that they created. Now, moving up to a little more detailed here, we have the inflatable models, and there's some pretty interesting ones here. These are actually really intricate in their designs, a lot more than just a balloon, or a lot more than what we saw from the Ghost Army in World War II, which, of course, those famous pictures of the soldiers holding the inflatable tanks and moving them around to confuse the Germans. But there's a couple notable ones right now. We have the inflatable tanks, the M270 MLRS that showed up in the last video that attracted a Russian missile strike. And recently, we're seeing images of inflatable F-16s that have begun to appear, although not in Ukraine, at least not yet. Now, I wouldn't be shocked to hear that Ukraine starts to use some of these inflatable F-16 mock-ups, but as of this video, we haven't necessarily seen those in use. These are sort of in the middle ground of modern decoys. They're more expensive, of course, than painting something on the ground or even throwing a couple 2x4s and pipes together. And unfortunately, after even a relatively close impact, it's probably going to be shot. I mean, how many holes in this thing are you going to patch up before just replacing it entirely? However, these are pretty inexpensive, all things considered. They can be transported to the front pretty easily and set up in most cases in under 10 minutes. So Russian forces could, in effect, wake up one morning thinking they've got a fresh company of tanks across from their lines that wasn't there yesterday. Something as simple as that could trigger the redeployment of Russian recon assets to find out exactly what's going on, which means they have to be pulled from somewhere else along the front. Maybe they use some sort of precision munition to carry out a strike, or even just sowing a little more confusion in the local Russian command. That's a pretty decent trade-off for a few fancy balloons. Now, moving up to kind of the highest level, if you will, here, we have wooden/fully manufactured, because they come in a variety of different materials, and these get fancy fast. In fact, in August of 2022, the Washington Post reported that the Russian army had been hunting wooden decoys of HIMARS across Ukraine. At that time, Moscow boasted of their destruction almost daily. Russia wasted at least 10 $6.5 million caliber cruise missiles on these decoys in the initial weeks of the HIMARS deployment. Talk about a real-world impact there. I mean, there's a direct dollar amount spent on pieces of wood targeted and destroyed by the Russian military. In fact, the War Zone went into some additional detail on some IRIS-T mock-ups. That's a more advanced air defense system that's been sent to Ukraine recently. They said these decoys replicate the 8x8 launch vehicle for the IRIS-T, a cross-country truck complete with stabilizing outriggers that can be deployed, an access ladder for the crew, wing mirrors, and a fuel filter. The decoy is shown loaded with containerized missiles at the rear of the truck, while the desert camouflage scheme is also familiar. It was seemingly applied on systems originally built for Egypt, but then transferred to Ukraine. Talk about level of detail, right? Down to it's a different paint color because it wasn't supposed to come to Ukraine in the first place. It's little things like that when Russia is looking at certain weapon types that could stand out as, hey, that's relatively authentic. They talked about an additional decoy here, a radar system that's stationary, so this is useful. The decoy of the trailer-mounted AM MPQ-64 takes realism a step further, with a mechanism that ensures the fake radar antenna rotates as on the real thing. The system has a scan rate of 30 RPM to provide 360-degree coverage. So these are the types of changes being made to convince the Russian observers that what they're seeing is the real thing, wasting a precision munition on this fake target and possibly giving up the location of an observer and or launch platform somewhere along the front. And of course, we're not just seeing this from Ukraine. Russia is using decoys as well. Even Decoy Trenches, which is interesting. Apparently, especially during last summer's offensive in the south, they say Russian forces used decoy trenches to entice Ukrainian forces into attacking trenches filled with dummies and improvised explosive devices, which are then detonated once Ukrainian troops begin to clear them. According to an article in Business Insider, a Ukrainian commander call sign Voskres said that when they reached the Russian lines after clearing part of a minefield along a tree line, Ukrainian forces dropped into the trench ready for a fight. He said, quote, "The trenches were mined. Our guys started jumping in and the trenches started blowing up," recalling that as the Russians remotely detonated the mines that filled the trench, explosive drones attacked the survivors. So it's a type of decoy, if you will. Again, it sounds like they had mannequins and equipment kind of staged there to make it look through aerial reconnaissance like this was a portion of the Russian lines, but in the end, the Russians used some of these trenches as just a trap. Now, we've talked about the different types of decoys, but I feel like it's worth getting into some more detailed requirements as to how these can still be effective on the modern battlefield. According to a recent article in Euromaidan, they said decoys require special simulators to mimic explosions and fires after missile or artillery strikes. So it's not just getting Russia to hit the target in the first place, but for them to then think that after they did so, that they actually destroyed that piece of equipment. So in that M270 decoy video that we played at the beginning, there's a noticeable lack of secondary explosions that Russia explains away as saying that Ukraine must have fired all of their rockets. But you can see they noticed that, right? In the initial posting of that video, that's the kind of thing these decoy manufacturers are thinking about, finding a way to show some sort of large secondary explosion that's consistent with hitting that type of platform. The goal for all of these is not every time a decoy is destroyed to show that to Russia and say, ha, you hit a decoy. Ukraine wants Russia to think they hit the real thing for as long as possible. They say camouflage must narrowly balance being undetectable, yet visible enough to attract fire. I mean, a decoy sitting out in the middle of an open field where Ukraine would not normally have equipment isn't going to trick the Russians, right? They're going to pretty clearly see that it's a decoy. So instead, we've seen some of these decoys that are dug in to fighting positions, others with camo netting, and talk about an art, right? Being able to camouflage these to where they look realistic, but not so well camouflaged and hidden that the Russians miss it entirely. That's an acquired skill set. They say minimal personnel required for decoy operations and maintenance. Bet you didn't think about this, right? A decoy is not set it and forget it. You have to make this thing look realistic. So this one applies, really for the radar one specifically, but probably multiple types of equipment. Having a crew walk around the site a little bit, pretend to do some sort of basic maintenance would be easily faked on any sort of radar decoy. A little bit harder to do on a multiple launch rocket system or a tank. I mean, the radar, again, here isn't supposed to move at all. So from a distance, you can see people moving around it like you would expect them to. But if an observer is watching a specific location for a long period of time and a tank never moves, or an artillery piece never fires, nobody ever gets inside of the MLRS system, that's a little bit suspicious, and it might kind of trigger that could be a decoy. Now, there's a lot of positives to the use of decoys in the battlefield, and Ukraine has used them exceptionally well, but there are some downsides here. I mean, it might be tempting to try to flood the battlefield with these decoys, but they have to be used strategically. Ukraine wants Russia to continue to see something, then shoot, but as the decoys become more widespread, there's the risk that Russia dials in their targeting process to where they can more easily identify some of these fakes. A source quoted in that Guardian article associated with the manufacture of these decoys said, quote, "In skilled hands, such mock-ups can safeguard lives and equipment while forcing the enemy to expend costly munitions. But ineptly used, decoys can backfire, prompting more careful enemy reconnaissance instead of indiscriminate strikes." But that's all I got for now. Of course, if interested in this or other national security subjects, be sure to check out Between the Lines, our reader-funded national security publication that is linked in the description below, along with all of the sources used in this video. But thanks for watching, and I'll see y'all next time.